Hey, I'm Toby and welcome back. It's been a minute. In fact, it's been a 3-month long minute. But we're back and I read 50 books this year and I'll be talking about my top 10 books, and it's a cute full circle moment. You know, my first ever YouTube video was this time last year where I talked about my top books of 2021, and I read 4 more books this year than last year. So, you know, we're making progress a little bit, baby steps. And my goal was 50. I reached it, so we're happy. So gonna start with 5 honourable mentions and then I'll get into the top 10, start from number 10, work our way up to number 1. The first book that I want to talk about is Brickmakers by Selva Almada, and this is an Argentinian book and has been translated from the Spanish into English by McDermott. So with this book, we start and we end with death. There are these 2 men who are in a knife fight and they're both dying on the floor. We kind of go back to figure out how they both got to this point. As they're taking their final breaths, you know they're gonna die. And that was quite an interesting premise to start with that I really enjoyed. And what I really love that Almada explores in this book is toxic masculinity, homophobia, wealth inequality, social inequality, misogyny, especially in this small Argentinian town. And it is a very bleak narrative, but also a very real and unapologetic narrative of these things in this culture in a small rural town. Although it is very bleak and it's quite dark at times, hope still glimmers here and there, and I really found myself rooting for these characters despite how flawed they are. That's the first book. Oh, next is a beautiful short story collection. My Pen is the Wing of a Bird, and this is the first short story collection book of its kind. There are 18 short stories and these are written by Afghan women. These narratives are owned by Afghan women. The fact that we just get the chance to peek into the creative minds of these different Afghan women is amazing. And many of these fictional stories are inspired by real events and they will evoke such raw and strong emotions from you, from joy and hope to despair and sorrow. And the stories really vary. You even get looks into gender, into misogyny, into education, into just all different narratives. Some of the writing is really beautiful, some of it is very straightforward, but it's very accessible. It's a book that I can recommend pretty much to anyone. It is a must read. Next we have Stolen Tongues by Felix Blackwell, and this is a horror novel. It's the first horror novel that's genuinely frightened me enough where I slept with the lights on for the next couple of nights. And we are following these 2 characters who are engaged. They go up to this cabin up in like the mountains and the woods to celebrate their engagement, to have some alone time. But is it really alone time? Because they're hearing these ghastly wails. It sounds like there's a child crying somewhere in the forest. There's seems like there's a man or some dark shadow that's walking around or lurking around this cabin. So it's not the romantic getaway that they thought they had signed up for. And all I'll say, because obviously I don't want to go too much of the plot away because that's the beauty of a horror novel, to find out what happens, is if you already have any fears of sleepwalking or sleep talking, this book might not be for you, because new fears unlocked for me. What Blackwell did so well throughout the entire narrative was just maintaining this unease and creepiness and just this feeling of being on edge constantly. There were just these underlying horrors that were just seeping through every page throughout. So the big reveal, I wasn't even focused on that. I was just turning the page, just disturbed and pretty freaked out. And then I really enjoyed how there was this Native American folklore that's weaved throughout the tale, throughout the narrative. And I thought that added something really special to the book and to the narrative. However, Blackwell is a white American author, and his epilogue, where he touches on the Native American representation, I won't lie, I was giving white savior energy, which I wasn't here for. But if that's something that you're able to look past, then I would highly recommend this book if you genuinely want to be scared. The 4th honourable mention is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Machado. This is another short story collection, but This short story collection really hones in and puts women's bodies under the magnifying glass. These short stories explore the many ways that women's bodies and women in general are unfortunately violated in society, and Maria Machado uses magical realism, surrealism, horror, sci-fi, all these different genres to do that so superbly in such a unique and fresh way. She genuinely has cemented herself as one of my favourite authors, as I love how she normalizes queerness in her books. I also love just how daring and experimental and a bit out there her writing is. And I really appreciate that she takes those risks. And it's another wonderful book of hers that I read. And then my final honourable mention is A Psalm for the A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. Essentially, people refer to this as comfort sci-fi, as we follow this non-binary monk and also a robot. And essentially, the book follows their friendship. It discusses identity, purpose. Do we need some big grand purpose in life to be fulfilled? So essentially in this book, we follow this tea monk, and they're at this point in life where they don't know what to do. They want to go out into the world, and as they're doing this, they journey into the wilderness and bump into a robot. People thought that robots were extinct because back in the day, they were created essentially for manual labor in factories. One day, all the robots supposedly gained consciousness and said, "Peace, see ya. We're out, we're done being your slaves," and they go off into the wilderness, never to be seen again, and essentially become myth and legend. But this monk we're following, they bump into a robot, and then that's where that friendship and their journey together begins. And yeah, so joyful, love it. Now onto my actual top 10 books of 2022. So at number 10, we have Assembly by Natasha Brown. So this is a tiny book, but wow, Brown packs a punch in this book and says a lot in these few pages. And we're essentially following a narrator who is a Black British woman who has this successful finance career in London. Essentially, the whole plot is us as we follow her as she goes deep into the English countryside for this lavish party that her boyfriend's family are going to be hosting. And the boyfriend's family are white. I'm not going to say anything else about the plot or what happens in this book. It takes certain twists and turns that I was not expecting, and what Natasha Brown does amazingly is that she just picks apart and dismantles 21st century colonialism and imperialism. And I love how all the characters in this book are unnamed, including the narrator, and their purpose is simply to fulfill a very specific but recognizable role, both in the narrative but also in society. I don't think Brown makes any necessarily groundbreaking or revolutionary social commentary in this book, but I just think it's such a unique and fresh way to show these things. 21st modern Britain and the long-lasting impact that colonialism and imperialism has had on our society today. It was just such a fresh way to capture microaggressions, racism, misogyny, being othered, the Black female experience, and class, and just even so much more in just like 100 pages. And I also loved that Brown was a bit experimental with form and with the style of this book. Is quite stylistic. There's a non-linear structure. The narration is quite detached. There are even vignettes throughout which almost speak like spoken words. So this book had the ingredients to potentially be very style over substance, but no, I think Brown managed to merge style and substance together very well to create this very smart, clever, and just unique book. At number 9, we have The Iliac Crest by Christina Rivera Garza, and it's translated from the Spanish into English by Sarah Booker. And this is a Mexican book, and it's one of the first books that I read in 2022, and it has stuck with me. It's a gothic, kaleidoscopic, just topsy-turvy book that really dismantles and dives into gender and how much of our language is gendered and what that means for people's place in society. also the way that people perceive themselves depending on the way language is gendered. The actual plot of this book, essentially, we have this unnamed narrator and these two women come to his house and start ruthlessly interrogating him that they know his secret. And the secret is that he is a woman. And you just see how the narrator's life almost starts falling apart from that moment as they feel so disoriented and confused by these accusations and the way they start perceiving themselves and trying to get down to the bottom of these accusations and where they've come from and what that means for them and themselves and how they're perceived, how they perceive themselves, how the world would perceive them, what it means for them going forward. And this book was a wonderful response to the rising femicides and the women who were disappearing from 20th century Mexican literature. And Rivera Garza is reappearing these women, giving them a voice, making sure that their stories and that they are heard through this, and just seeing how the idea of gender being binary is just such a ridiculous notion. And Rivera Garza was just so ahead of her time with this book, and I just think it is wonderful. Number 8, we have a classic, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. First time that I've ever read this book, and I'm so glad I didn't read this back in secondary school when I was like 15, 16, because I do not think I would have appreciated it the way I did this year. So this obviously is a Gothic classic, and we follow Victor Frankenstein, who decides he wants to create life, manages to actually do it, and then we see the consequences of this, not just in Frankenstein's life, but also in other people's lives. And then for the creature, for the monster itself too. What I really, really love with this book is how Shelley really poignantly captures what it means to be human, what it means to have a fulfilling life, the importance of relationships and having connections with other people, people who understand you. And also I love how she shows how all-consuming a cyclical hatred and vengeance is. And she really explores the dangers of scientific progression, the dangers of loneliness, and how the desire to be accepted in society can become all-consuming, and it's very easy to become obsessive over that desire to be accepted, and the importance of what it means to have a society, to have a community that you can be a part of. And then the lines of good, bad, evil, morality, the way they're all blurred throughout this entire narrative is just wonderful. And I love that you'll really be wondering who the true villain is by the end of the book. And this, yeah, definitely my new favorite classic. And number 7, we have a book that actually came out this year, and that is Open Water by Caleb Azumah Nelson. Ugh, this book is just, I feel like it was written for me, and I'm so glad that Nelson decided to write this. So this book essentially follows 2 young Black British Londoners who meet one day in a pub in Southeast London. One is a photographer and the other is a dancer / uni student. And you really see how they first have a friendship and that evolves into something more. And you just see how they fall in and out of love, and you feel so invested in the relationship and their connection. It feels so raw and honest and true. The whole book is just a very poetic illustration of what it means to be a young Black British person in London. Azumah Nelson explores masculinity, racial identity, the arts, creativity, music, grief, love, friendships, all these things, mental health even, in such a short space of time and in such a lyrical way as well. The writing in this is beyond stunning. It's beyond gorgeous. Every time I was reading it, I was just like, he's a poet. He's actually a poet. If you enjoy Ocean Vuong's writing, then you really will appreciate the writing in this as well. As a young Black British woman myself, I just really felt like this book was a love letter to me and my experiences so far in life. And I'm very, very, very excited to see what else Azumah Nelson will be bringing out. There's not much that happens really plot-wise, but it's about more character study and the connection between these two and how that is explored. And as I said, all these other different themes that also get explored subsequently because of their identities and who they are and their place in the world is just done so well. So well. And you can just tell that Azumah Nelson is likely writing from his own experiences, as he is a Black British Ghanaian man. At number 6 is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. And this is actually the first book that I read in 2022. And I still cannot stop thinking about it. I initially gave it, I think, a 4 stars actually, because the first 100 pages were a bit slow, but nah, this is definitely a 5 stars. That's why star ratings are a bit redundant, because the way this has stayed with me for an entire year, phenomenal. So in this book, we're following these 4 Native American men who are from the Blackfoot community in the US. They are indigenous, they're Native American. When they were teenagers, they did something that they should not have done. They really should not have done. And then we're now following them as they're all adults, as they're all living their own lives separately, as nature comes to get revenge and wreak havoc on each and every one of their lives. I will always go back to these 3 words to describe this book: dread, paranoia, claustrophobia. The way that those 3 things are maintained superbly throughout this book, I've never read anything like it. Like, genuinely, this stressed me out so much, like in a good way, but I'd have to actually put the book down because my blood pressure would be rising so much. What I really loved was the way that Graham Jones captured intergenerational trauma really, really well in this book. And also the way he made Native ideologies and belief systems very accessible to those of us who aren't Indigenous. And I thought that was really, really fascinating to get an insight into that from someone who actually is Indigenous themselves. And it was a really great display of how modern Native Americans in the 21st century are keen to maintain some of these ancient native traditions, but also are breaking away from some of these traditions too, and seeing how that can cause this conflict for a lot of modern Native Americans. Genuinely just can't stop thinking about it, and like, it's a book that I'm already just so excited to reread at some point because phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. At number 5, we have Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, and it's translated from the Spanish into English by Sarah Booker. This is another Mexican novel, although this one is a lot more bleak, disturbing, dark, depressing than the Iliac Crest that I mentioned as my number 9. So we start this book and the witch is dead. A group of children who are playing by the irrigation canals find her body, and this propels the whole village into an investigation about how and why she was murdered. And the reason I say the witch in quotations is because it's not supernatural in any sense, but the woman who's murdered is someone who used like alternative medicines to help treat a lot of women with certain ailments or conditions or help that they needed. And also as well, on top of that, because she's transgender, just because of the transphobia in this small Mexican village, again, that kind of propels this idea of her as this witch. And although this book is, you do find out why and how she was murdered, like, it's not a murder mystery. Like, that is not the focal point of the book. The murder, it's not thrilling or a thriller in that sense. No, what this is a bleak, pessimistic, violent and claustrophobic portrait of this small Mexican village. And Melchor does not shy away from really showing the extent of misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, violence, especially against women, entrenched machismo in this poverty-stricken village. The language is stomach-churning and extremely disturbing at times, and the characters in this are not characters who you'll find yourself rooting for, who really have any redeemable characteristics about them, but it is just so, it's raw and honest, just insight into their lives and really showing how cyclical the violence is in the lives within these characters in this story, and how embedded it is in every single one of their lives, and how this book feels so claustrophobic. Even the writing is just very dense. There are no paragraph breaks, and it has this very claustrophobic feel to it, this whole narrative, and it kind of is able to capture the claustrophobic nature of this village that these characters are stuck in and seemingly unable to escape. Like, this is it, this is their lives, and it's not their fault that they were born into this, but a lot of them just don't see a way out, and we just see how that then results in many, many sad and bleak narratives for a lot of these characters. We follow, you know, quite a large cast of characters in this. Not that it's confusing at all. We're not really going back and forth. We just change us to a slightly different perspective. People refer to this as a masterpiece, and I 100% agree that this is a masterpiece. However, it's not a book that I can just freely recommend to everyone and anyone, because it is so disturbing and dark, the content, and I can't even truly say I had an enjoyable reading experience, because what's enjoyable about this? But it just was a wonderful piece of literature, of art, and I'm very glad to have read it, but I would highly recommend you check out trigger warnings before reading it, because genuinely probably has every trigger warning, content warning under the sun. And number 4, we have Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, and it's translated from the Japanese into English by Ginny, Tapley, Takemori. And the cover may look cute, and you might think it's going to be a lot more lighthearted than hurricane season. Don't be fooled. Do not be fooled. This book is intentionally provocative, outrageous, radical, and disturbing, but definitely in not such a bleak way like hurricane season. There is a slightly more light-hearted feel to this book, but at the crux of it, it is still quite a bleak-ish narrative. So in this book, we follow this girl who's quite young, and she seems to have this really strong connection with her cousin, who she only gets to see once a year, when all the families, they drive up to the grandma's house, like the matriarch of the family, who lives up in the mountains in Japan. And this girl and her cousin, they believe that they're not from this world, that they're otherworldly, that they're aliens, in the sense that they need some sort of coping mechanism to deal with all the stuff that's going on in their lives that they want to essentially escape from. However, an incident happens at one of these family retreats that happens every year, and the girl, her cousin, not allowed to see each other again. Then we now fast forward into the future. Now she's a woman. She's in a marriage of convenience, as her partner is asexual. I don't think we specify if the protagonist is asexual, but she doesn't seem to have too much interest in romantic or sexual relationships with other people. And then we see how her and her husband, and they reconnect with the cousin, and how they decide to live on the fringe of society, to happily embrace being outcasts and different to what society says is normal. And Murata, if you've read any of her books, loves really delving into how homogenous society is and how weird that is. She kind of takes it to the extreme in this book by showing why should we live life the way that society tells us and the way that's deemed to be normal, just because that's what we believe, when you could wake up tomorrow and believe something completely different. And she really runs with that idea. And also when people try to force this very narrow-minded idea of what a fulfilling life is, what a good life is, what a normal life is, how that can then, you know, potentially push people who don't fit into that mold, who don't want to fit into that mold, to take drastic steps to separate themselves from that. So this is a very out there book, but I absolutely loved how weird and out there and how dark it got. I found Convenience Store Women, which is another novel by this author, okay. I know a lot of people love it. I found it okay, and this explores those same themes just in a much darker, weirder, brave and daring and experimental way, which It's right up my alley. Now we're going into the top 3. So number 3 is The English Understands War by Helen DeWitt. And this is one I read quite recently. It's a novella and it is one of the smartest and wittiest just gem of a book that I've ever read. I have to thank Jalen from the Bar and Bookcase for raving about this novella. Otherwise, I don't think I ever really would have heard of it. In this book, we're following this 17-year-old girl who's been raised in Marrakesh by her French mother and English father, and they live a very affluent, extremely wealthy and highly cultured lifestyle. She has, you know, the best piano tutors in the world, can play like the harp and can speak however many languages and knows all about tailoring and all these things for, you know, high life society. Then one day during their annual Ramadan trip, she ends up finding her life overturned by quite a shocking revelation. And because of this revelation, she gets approached by a lot of publishers about, you know, signing a book deal to talk about how this has affected her life and XYZ. So the main point of this book is just DeWitt is giving a massive middle finger to capitalism, but especially to the publishing industry in particular. And she really just shows how problematic it is the way the publishing industry glamorizes and profits from trauma narratives. And she just uses the right amount of pretentiousness and mockery to shine light on this very serious issue. And I mean, DeWitt herself has had her own qualms with the publishing industry a lot throughout her career. So I love that she uses this wonderful novella to kind of be able to poke fun at, but also actually really shine light on this serious issue. And the way she uses this 17-year-old girl to kind of attack the publishing industry, these New York sharks, it's just such a smart way. I wish it was longer. Not because it needed to be longer. I think actually it being a novella was the right thing. Like DeWitt just got it right. I just want more because it was that good. Number 2, this is a book that I've talked about plenty of times already on this channel, and that is Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung, and it's translated from the Korean into English by Anton Her. And this is a short story collection that ranges over different genres, from horror to magical realism to sci-fi to surrealism and to fables even. And it essentially is presenting the real horrors that we face in society, from capitalism to misogyny to motherhood, inequality, revenge, unresolved trauma, and so much more. And again, I think you'll see there's a common theme in these books that I love, where they're quite out there, they're quite daring. The writing in this is very straightforward, but wow, the way these stories are so alive and are vivid and just jump off the pages and will really just stick in your mind. I mean, the first story is about a head that pops out of the toilet. So that gives you a little insight into what you have coming for you. And I just love how Chung will just delicately shift the tone in each story to reveal the true unsettling intention and purpose of the narrative for each story, to kind of present that real horrors that she actually is exposing that we have to face in society, and especially shining a light on Korean modern society as well. So it was really great to have that insight. How does she even come up or conceive these ideas? And wow, her mind's a little bit disturbing, but I'm here for it. If you enjoy daring experimental writing that includes a lot of social commentary, then this is the book for you. And then we're on to number 1, and that is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This book is... So this is non-fiction, and I don't read much of it, so the fact this is number 1 is very, very impressive. It's a memoir by Chanel Miller, who was Emily Doe in the 2015 Stanford Uni sexual assault case. And this case gained a lot of traction because Brock Turner, who was the man who assaulted Chanel, people were almost portraying him as the victim in this case. Although he was sentenced, it was a very, very lenient sentencing. I think maybe it was 6 months, and obviously with good behaviour, he's not even going to have to serve all of that. And then Chanel, in response, wrote this extremely powerful and moving and raw and honest victim impact statement. BuzzFeed then published it. It went viral. It went so viral, and it encouraged her to come forward about her true identity, which is why I think the cover of this is amazing, where she's really reclaiming the fact she was Emily Doe in the case, and now she's here as Chanel Miller to tell her story. It's her narrative, and it is done stunningly. We primarily follow Miller herself in this book, as she really just has to navigate life, her mental health, her friendships, relationships, work, just living, existing and getting by, as well as following the trial itself, how long that was drawn out, and just the difficulties surrounding that. And the way that Miller captures and relays the turmoil that accompanies sexual assault was just phenomenal and so relatable. If you've been through anything similar to what she's been through, this will resonate with you so much. And I know people too who've read this and they don't have any personal experiences close to this. Luckily, they still found that it really resonated with them too. And my eyes were really dry throughout this reading experience. I felt seen, I felt heard, I felt angry, but I also felt hopeful. And the fact that Miller is able to take you on a journey where you feel all these different emotions just, I mean, shows how captivating and incredible her writing is. And then because she is actually a creative writing graduate, not just only is the content of this so important and so powerful, it's the fact the writing itself is beautiful, how metaphorical it is, but it's not that it's style over substance. It doesn't detract from her story. It adds to it, it brings it to life, it makes it so relatable, and you just find yourself completely just catapulted into her world, into her state of mind at different junctions of her journey towards healing, towards a life post sexual assault, where this assault is not all that she is. She's witty, she's smart, she's just so honest and raw with this. It can be hard to read at times, and if you've gone through anything similar, it can be triggering at points, because certain feelings and things that she expresses will trigger you, you'll be able to relate to, but also it's cathartic as well to be like, someone else has gone through this, and just makes you feel far less alone if you've gone through anything similar. I cannot recommend this book enough, only if you are in a headspace where you can read this sort of content, because obviously there isn't a humongous trigger warning, content warning for sexual assault. So yeah, this book is just phenomenal. Again, it's a book that I read, I think in January of 2022, and can't stop thinking about it. Any other book that she ever publishes, I will read it. It could be a children's book, I will buy it and read it. So those are my best books of 2022. I had a pretty successful reading year, and my next video should hopefully be talking about 23 books that I want to read in 2023. So look out for that. As I said, I'm back, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.